and also for Professor Khaled for the invitation and opportunity today. Wait, I have that now, okay. I have first to say that I'm agreeing that the meeting will be.
Yes, thank you.
Yeah, okay. So now again, huh? Yeah, okay. Yeah, and so I would like to present the research of the German Archaeological Institute and its Ethiopian and German cooperation partners in the region of Tigray in northern Ethiopia. And I'm very glad to present it here as part of the AVA lecture program. The war that had been waging in Tigray since November 2020 has resulted in one of the largest humanitarian catastrophes in the East African region, the scope of which, combined with the terrible human rights violation, cannot yet be fully foreseen or comprehended. Obviously, this is not the subject of today's lecture. However, it should not go undermentioned as this conflict by extension threatens the unique cultural heritage of the country. In addition to the famous rock churches and the World Cultural Heritage Sites of Aksum, with its palaces, tomb, and famous stele, there are a number of archaeological sites in Tigray whose roots trace back too far before the Christianization of the country, meaning the time before the conversion of the Aksumite ruler Isana to Christianity in the 4th century AD. These early sites and their archaeological museums are also in danger of being looted and destroyed by fighting. The Sana branch of the Orient department of the German Archaeological Institute has been working since 2009 at 4 of these early settlements in Tigray, marked in red on this map. These include Yeha, 2 sites near Aksum, Hawelti and Melazo, and another to the north of the provincial capital Mekelle near Wukro. Together with the Ethiopian antiquity authorities, we are exploring the formation of a complex society established here in the early 1st millennium BC. Already in prehistoric times, the Ethiopian Highlands were not isolated, but integrated into various mobility systems, such as migration movements, exchange, and trade. Thus, regional and sub-regional interaction routes connected this region with the Near East, especially with South Arabia, which I will discuss in detail, and from the 1st century after Christ, as you can see here on the map, during the Aksumite period, beyond the Red Sea to Rome, Greece, and India, and to the south. But also within the African continent, especially toward the north and northeast, cultural contact existed. River and river valleys, such as the Nile and its tributaries, but also dry valleys formed important communication and trade routes, as well as the maritime routes across the Red Sea. This network of communication routes goes so far that many researchers, and we agree with this, have assimilated the Ethiopian Highlands, Eritrea, and the Middle Nile Valley with the famous land of Punt, known from Egyptian sources. To Punt, the pharaohs accomplished their Punt expeditions from the middle of the 3rd millennium BC until the late 2nd millennium BC. However, scientific evidence for the exact location of Punt has not yet been provided. A famous representation of these Punt expeditions has been preserved in the temple of Pharaoh Hatshepsut near Luxor from the 5th century BC. Please note in the figure below the transplantation of incense trees from the land of Punt, which is of special interest in our context today. While the trade goods of Punt have been evaluated on the basis of such iconographic sources, as well as the inscriptions, mainly from an Egyptian perspective, a systematic study of the intra-African exchange and trade goods from the northern Horn of Africa's perspective is still missing. If we consider, for example, the paintings from the burial chapel of the Vizier Rechmire from Thebes West, also from the 15th century BC, we see various tributaries from Punt carrying incense trees along with other goods, including precious stones. Furthermore, tributaries from Nubia are carrying ivory, ebony, and also exotic animals. Probably traded from the Ethiopian Highlands was a volcanic glass obsidian, whose sources lie in Tigray and which was used for tools and also art objects of various kinds. The material of this handball from Abydos, produced in Egypt in the late 4th millennium BC, originates from the highlands and confirms that Egypt imported obsidian from Ethiopia already in prehistoric times and processed the raw material locally. Interestingly, moreover, Ethiopian obsidian was also discovered in the coastal region of Yemen from archaeological context of the 6th millennium BC. Already during these times, there must have been some sort of connection between both sides of the Red Sea. One of the most important trade goods between Egypt and the Ethiopian highlands, however, would have been incense. Due to Egypt's immense demand for aromatics, it can be assumed that the procurement network extended far into the Ethiopian highlands. Furthermore, Egypt's demand for gold was possibly not only covered by Nubian gold deposits, but also by Ethiopian gold. Even today, as you can see here, gold is washed from gold soaps in a so-called gold valley near Yeha. Whether or which goods in return reach the northern Horn of Africa from Egypt or the Middle Nile Valley, as of now, has only reconstructed in a rudimentary form. Accordingly, the exact cause of these interactions is still completely unclear. So far, it is assumed that direct contact between Egypt and the highlands was only established through maritime trade, whilst Nubia with the Kerma culture area acted as an intermediary prior to this. Incense, gold, obsidian, and probably also ivory are the naturally occurring raw materials in Tigray and obviously played a decisive role for the outer African contacts of the Ethiopian highlands from the 2nd millennium BC at the latest. Nevertheless, it took until the beginning of the 1st millennium BC before a complex society was formed in this region, here marked in orange. Its emergence is less related to the expansion of the network of inner African contacts with the Nile Valley than to external factors, namely the immigration of Sabaean population groups from the region around Marib in present-day Yemen. In order to investigate these contacts between South Arabia and the Northern Horn of Africa, we began an Ethiopian-German joint project with the University of Jena and a number of international cooperation partners at the site of Yeha, here marked in red, in the Ethiopian highlands in 2009. The focus of our research questions is, among other topics, the investigation of the process of interaction between South Arabian and indigenous African population groups. These realities are often described with terms such as acculturation or the process of culture change. As was often the case in antiquity, the driving force behind these interactions was mobility and the accompanying cultural transfer. In this case, determined by the expansion and control of economic activities. The creation of economic networks was important, if not absolutely existential, in order not only to achieve the best possible profit, but also to reach more distant resources. In order to preserve this, alliances with the most diverse character had to be formed across political territories or tribal boundaries and beyond cultural and religious differences. Not only mobility systems such as exchange and trade, but also migration can create a global network between different cultural areas. How can we imagine the migration of Sabaean populations from the region around Marib to the Ethiopian Highlands, about 700 kilometers away across the Red Sea in the early first millennium BC? For this purpose, I would first like to turn your attention to South Arabia itself, more precisely to the Sabaean heartland around the oases of Marib and Saba. Here, almost 10-year war in Yemen is currently escalating and massive destruction of cultural heritages can be observed. But the destruction of Yemen's cultural treasures would be a topic for another whole lecture. However, at this border of the Yemeni highlands and the desert zones, several artificially created oases were formed at the end of the second millennium BC. The largest of these oases with the best natural and agricultural conditions is the oasis of Marib, which has been one of the focal points of research of the Sana branch of the Archaeological Institute for more than, let's say, nearly 50 years. Already at the beginning of the first millennium BC, the center of the South Arabian community of Saba was the capital Marib, which you can see in the back, and which was formed here. The research data we have generated in this region provides a comprehensive picture of the Sabaean cultural landscape. This includes the history of Saba, its most important cities, Marib and Saba. You see on the left side the Al-Makka temple of Saba, as well as other temple buildings with their typical pillar architecture, also typical for South Arabia. In addition, there are the Sabaean cemeteries on the right, in the form of a tower-like mausoleums in which the dead were buried collectively and whose facades, as well as tomb stelae, show the head portraits of the deceased that are typical of South Arabia. Another important aspect is a research on innovative irrigation techniques in the Marib oasis, which I would like to present to you in more detail in order to illustrate the effort that had to be made to create a flourishing cultivated landscape in this arid region. The irrigation of the fields was only possible by using the twice-yearly monsoon rains in the highlands of Yemen. The rainfall there gathered in the wadis and poured as mighty streams into the arid desert zones of the country. You see here, the black one is the modern dam of Marib, and the green part are the fields, the oasis. And the Wadi Dana, which you see here in the middle, near Marib, drains an area of about 10,000 square kilometers of the Yemeni highlands, which corresponds to an average annual water volume of 200 million cubic meters. This enormous amount of water had to be used in a well-targeted manner. At the same time, the seasonal floods did not only bring the urgently needed water, but simultaneously threatened settlements and agricultural land as they took the form of raging with rivers. Only the knowledge of their temporal occurrence and the power of these water masses allowed the precise planning of irrigation systems in antiquity. In order to utilize as much water as possible from the only short-term floods, development of technical skills for the construction of large irrigation systems was crucial. The principle of this irrigation technique was not to store the water in a modern dams, but to dam up the water in order to raise the water level, to calm its destructive forces in a stilling basin, to discharge it selectively into a channel system, and thus to flood the fields in a controlled manner. For this purpose, the Sabaeans built an earth dam over 680 meters long, almost 100 meters wide, and about 20 meters high, with stone stiffings and the so-called Great Dam of Marib. You see here on the right-hand side a model built in Hamburg, at the university in Hamburg, with the dam and the water behind and the stilling bases and the overflow. This dam was built at the point where the Wadi Dana breaks through the limestone mountains. In front of this, the water dammed up, calmed down, and was directed to the sites where outlet constructions, the so-called north and south sluices, are located. These outlets, which had to withstand the greatest pressure of water, were built directly on the natural rock to prevent the foundations from being washed away. Here, the south sluice, and you see that it's really built directly on the rock. When the water reached the sluices, it flowed into a stilling basin where it was calmed and slowed down so that it could be safely fed into the channel network. Via the main channel, the water reached the main distributor, and from here, with only a minimum flow gradient, an increasingly diverging channel network finally reached the fields of about 1 to 2 hectares. They were flooded once about knee-deep, which guaranteed one harvest. An area of about nearly 10,000 hectares could be irrigated and cultivated in this way. A quite elaborate undertaking. This system was to last for more than 1,200 years until its final demise in the 6th, 7th century AD. The basis of Sabaean society was thus the creation and intensive use of agricultural land. This, combined with military campaigns to consolidate and expand Saba's territory, led to the gaining control of Saba over one of the most important ancient interaction routes in South Arabia, the so-called incense route, by the 8th century BC at the latest. This trade route is to be understood as a synonym for a network of connecting routes, the course of which was not static, but subject to constant change depending on the political constellations and economic centers. Not only aromatics and other goods were transported along this route, but a wide variety of cultural influences also found their way into and from South Arabia. As shown on this map, the frankincense route begins in the frankincense region in the southwest of present-day Oman, in the province of Dhofar, and extends from South Arabia toward the Levant and Mesopotamia. Nevertheless, during the early 1st millennium BC, control over the trade in these aromatics was not in the hands of the inhabitants of Dhofar, but, as mentioned, in the hands or under the control of Saba around Marib, 700 kilometers away. This inscription, which we uncovered in the Sabaean city of Saba near Marib, in the sanctuary dedicated to the high Sabaean god Al-Makka, is more than 7 meters long and tells the deeds of the Sabaean ruler Yesamawata bin Yaqub Malik, who is named as the Sabaean Ita-Amma in the annals of the Assyrian king Sargon II around 715 BC. The inscription reports on the political history of the Sabaeans. Like other Sabaean ruler inscriptions, however, the text is completely silent about connections that Saba maintained beyond South Arabia, for example, through trade relations. But not only in Saba, also on the Ethiopian side, there are no written sources that give us information about the motives or the process of migration of Sabaean population groups to Ethiopia. So far, this process can only be approximately reconstructed through a combination of different findings, whereby much must still remain hypothetical. The expansion and control of economic activities with the connection of different economic areas were certainly decisive impulses. Like the temporary contacts that Saba maintained at this time via overland trade with regions outside South Arabia and the Arabian Peninsula, the Sabaeans actually settled permanently in the Ethiopian Highlands. It is therefore not only a question of the mobility of individuals over longer distances, but the intention of returning to the place of departure, as was the case, for example, with a change in trade relations, diplomatic journeys, and pilgrimage, but also with military campaign. But rather a special form of mobility that is connected with a change of location over longer distances and specifically with the proposal of permanent settlement at the destination. The scenario of the Sabaean migration into the northern Horn of Africa is difficult to imagine without the immense economic advantage gained, possibly combined with the social advantage of individuals. What happened during the process of interlinking South Arabian and indigenous culture which was called Ethio-Sabaean because of its mutual influence. Let us first look at the root of the Sabaeans and the Ethio-Sabaean settlement system, as well as the natural conditions that led to the constitution of a new economic area in this region. After crossing the highlands in Yemen, the Sabaean reached the Southern Arabian coastal region, the Tihama. Two sites, as we know until now, located here, Al-Midaman and Al-Hamid, have Sabaean finds and also a Sabaean temple of the early first millennium BC, so that they could have served as stopovers. In order to cross over the Tihama with sailing boats, knowledge of boat building and also of the monsoon winds was necessary. A landing point on the African side was the famous port of Adulis in the present-day Eritrea, which is still largely buried under the later Aksumite layers. Ethio-Sabaean pottery, and here on what you can see here on the right, fragments of Sabaean architectural decoration, such a fragment of a Sabaean alabaster throne, but also large sediments as remains of an irrigation technique operated according to South Arabian models, testify to the use of this harbor already in old Sabaean times. Adulis, the Sabaeans moved across Badis into the climatically more favorable and also fertile highlands. Once in the Ethiopian highlands, the Ethiopian Sabaean settlements line up on an axis running from north to south and east to west. So far, 30 settlements of this new Ethio-Sabaean community are known. According to the findings to date, it extends from the port of Adulis with the adjacent Eritrean highlands to Adiakawi in the south near Bukro, and via Yeha and Aksum to the region of Shire in the west. According to the Sabaean model, the area was, this is what we know from the inscriptions, under the rule of a king, also Saba Melik, or a Mukarib, this is the unifier. He not only built the sanctuaries in the most important settlements, but also palatial administrative buildings. Parallel to the Ethio-Sabaean settlement network, Puri indigenous culture also existed from the early first millennium BC onwards, such as the Ona culture around Asmara in the north, whose material remains, according to the current state of research, show no influence from South Arabia. The site of Yeha was reached from the port of Adulis after about 8 to 10 days march. It formed the political and religious center of the new community. Already around 800 BC, large residential areas, several necropolises, monumental buildings of administrative function, as well as at least 4 temple complexes were built here within a settlement of about 10 hectares. Like other Ethio-Sabaean sites, this site was not only connected with the local hinterland, but was also in regional contact with other Ethio-Sabaean sites. Yeha encompasses all the functions generally expected of such a central site: the presence of raw material extraction, handicraft, trade, and cult, combined with ruling structures and defense facilities. The latter obviously did not require fortification walls or other fortification facilities, which, unlike in South Arabia, are missing in all Ethio-Sabaean as well as indigenous settlements. If you look at this photograph after the rainy season, it becomes clear that what huge potential the area had as a residential area and what differences there was to the arid Marib. Embedded in a valley basin, surrounded by mountains up to 2,400 meters high, it is the present village with the modern name Yeha, which has been used since ancient times. Spring, following all the year round, guarantee people and animals a water supply independent of rainfall. One has to imagine the landscape was even more fertile 3,000 years ago. Here, our research on the paleo environment of Yeha has achieved quite extraordinary results. So far, the results prove that in the first millennium BC, a much more humid climate prevailed. There is evidence of at least 3 humid phases of about 60 to 150 years each, during which today's wadis as rivers permanently carried water. Compared to the Sabaean heartland, conditions were almost paradisical. The area was correspondingly fertile. The mountains ranging around Yeha were covered with dense juniper and olive tree forests. Their wood were used for the construction of Yeha's ancient monumental buildings, as you will see in a moment. Incense trees will also have grown here in large numbers, as can still be found near Yeha today. Raw material, such as the obsidian already mentioned, were available locally for the production of tools, as were sandstone and volcanic rocks, which were used as building materials. Natural resources in Yeha also, I already mentioned it, included gold deposits as early as antiquity. Thus, Ethio-Sabaean gold objects came to light in our excavations, such as these bronze sticks wrapped in gold, whose functional interpretation, however, remains an uncertainty to us, especially before the planned restoration. It was only with the South Arabian immigrants that knowledge of metalworking spread in Tigray, which can also be proven by the appearance of bronze objects. Older metal finds from the Ethiopian Highlands are not yet known. As in South Arabia, bronze tools were needed for carving the stone blocks, for instance, which were hewn and carefully smoothed in the Sabaean manner. Bronze sickles and perhaps already the metal plow led to more efficient agriculture techniques, such as probably also terrace agriculture, which has been known in South Arabia. You see a photo On the left side, from the terrace fields in the highland of Yemen, and right, the terrace fields nearby Yeha. And this, as you know, maybe has been known in South Arabia since the 3rd millennium BC. Geomorphological investigation should clarify whether this farming technique reached the northern Horn of Africa with the Sabaean migration or in post-Christian times through Aksumite contacts with South Arabia, or whether this was an independent development. What is for sure is that for the first time, the script, namely the Sabaean script and language, were introduced into this region. Other areas of the new culture can only be traced back to South Arabian tradition to a limited extent. Although the burial rites in Yeha with collective burials generally follow South Arabian traditions, the construction of chat tombs in the first half of the 1st millennium BC is limited to this region. Likewise, with the exception also for a few vessel types with cultic function, here you see the libation vessels, so-called torpedo-shaped vessels, which were made locally in Sabaean tradition, but except of such cultic vessels, normally the majority of pottery production show no Sabaean characteristics like the so-called black top bowl on the left-hand side. On the other hand, the religion and cult practices of the Sabaean immigrants were influenced by South Arabian features. Not only monumental temples were built according to the Sabaean model, but they were also dedicated to South Arabian deities. According to the archaeological findings, several sanctuaries of the main Sabaean god Amaka are known to us so far in Ethiopia. With the South Arabian pantheon, the religious iconography was also adapted. An example of this is the representation of the symbolic animal of the god Amaka, and as in Saba, stylized representation of ibexes decorated the architectural friezes, which originally formed the upper part of the inner temple walls. The South Arabian symbols of God, crescent moon, and disk are found here just as in South Arabian incense burners. In addition to libation and also in both cultures, the medium of smoke was used for communication. And also in addition, you can compare the libation and sacrificial proposals. For instance, at ritual meals, the cult participants ate meat together in honor of the gods, just as they did in South Arabia. This was cooked beforehand in large bronze vessels. A farmer found such a vessel decades ago while farming near Yeha and used it as a meat cooking pot at wedding feasts until recently. Interestingly is a Sabaean inscription on the rim which contains the name of a man. This man's clan came from the area of the oasis of Marib. He was probably a stonemason who left his inscription, as did other Sabaean stonemasons in the region. Stonemasons from the area around Marib were responsible for constructing at least the representative buildings according to South Arabian standards, for instructing the builders, and certainly for training unskilled workers. The intentional staging of South Arabian building forms was not only a continuation of South Arabian traditions, but also a manifestation of the power of the new community, which thus demonstrated its technical abilities as well as its economic prosperity. The South Arabian building programs are particularly reflected in the elaborately designed monumental buildings of Yeha. For example, the building material used for the outer wall of the temple of Yeha dedicated to the god Al-Makka and dating from the middle of the 7th century BC, was not the local sandstone, but the white limestone customary in South Arabia for Sabaean sacred buildings. However, this stone was not available on site, but had to be transported from the quarries near Wuku, about 150 kilometers away. A great logistical effort was required to cut approximately 1,000 cubic meters of stones, some of which were up to nearly 3.5 meters long and weighed more than 800 kilos, to transport them, to set them in the temple walls, and to finally carve and polish them. Other outstanding decorative elements, such as altar slabs, were made, like in Saba, of alabaster. However, no African material was used for the alabaster, but it was imported from South Arabia, from an alabaster quarry in the region of Marib that we investigated a few years ago in Yemen. The temple entrance, also built according to the South Arabian model, was originally composed of 6 monolithic pillars. However, these monoliths, weighing 12 tons, came from local sandstone quarries. The same applies to the pillars of the temple interior, which supported the ceiling of the main hall. A central rectangular opening allowed light to enter the interior of the 2-story structure. Altars, of which only fragments of the altar slab as well as foundations survived, must be added to this area. These can be reconstructed in miniature with a typical South Arabian architectural decoration, similar to the libation altar from the Al-Makka temple near Wuku, which is unique due to its state of preservation. A huge fire catastrophe, however, damaged the building already in antiquity, perhaps around the middle of the 1st millennium BC. In order to preserve this cultural heritage, we have been carrying out extensive restoration work with the Ethiopian Department of Antiquities since 2009, in addition to our scientific research. This included the installation of a stainless steel construction and the consolidation of the mensong. In addition to the construction of the sacred buildings, settlement policy measures of the Ethio-Sabaean rulers also included the construction of multi-story buildings. These were buildings with an administrative function, such as the administration of trade goods or harvest yields. In addition, they served as residences for the Ethio-Sabaean rulers or the upper class. The spatial arrangement of these multi-story buildings, which have only been preserved on the ground floor with small units of different functions, testify to the differentiated administrative organization at the head of which was the king. The palace-like building of Yeha is one of the oldest structures of the Ethio-Sabaean period to date, having been completed around 800 BC. The enormous complex is reconstructed as a multi-story building with a total height of 40 meters and had a ground plan of 65 by 60 meters. The walls, which were up to 2 and 20 meters wide, were built of quarry stones mortared with clay and reinforced with horizontal flat wooden beams. The ceiling, destroyed, but we found it on the ground, were also made of wood in the form of cassettes, and planks covered some of the floors as well as the doorsteps. Around the middle of the 1st millennium BC, also here a fire catastrophe destroyed the large building, as well as you see before, the Great Temple, the Al-Makka Temple, and other representative buildings of Yeha and other Ethio-Sabaean settlements. The cause and historical background of this intentional simultaneous destruction remains unclear. It nevertheless marked the end of the Ethio-Sabaean polity. When the so-called Gebryas, the palace of Yeha, was destroyed, several sources of fire must have burned simultaneously. Triggered by the large amount of wood used and the multi-story structure, which created a kind of chimney effect, the heat generated was up to 1,300 degrees Celsius. As a result, some of the quarry stone melted like slag. The clay mortar between and on top of the quarry stones became brickified, and the wooden beams were either completely destroyed or burned to charcoal. Remains of the 6-meter-high podium, the open staircase with a 6-pillar propylon, and the ground floor were preserved. Apart from the fire, the building was partially destroyed by the subsequent use of some rooms by modern traces of settlement. Other reasons for the building's destruction include the shaping of the terrain for the creation of terrace fields, or in other areas it was simply well sealed under the layer of rubble. Based on the excavation results of the French team led by Francis Onfray in the 1970s, and the new research of the German Archaeological Institute and its partners, the ground floor can be reconstructed as having been symmetrically arranged rooms that were accessed via 2 central transverse corridors. Protected by the falling ceiling beams or near the walls in the corner of the rooms, only a few remains of the inventory have survived, most of which must have been cleared out or looted before the fire. These are mainly fragments of pottery, some of them entire vessels, also in miniaturized forms such as small incense burners. It can be assumed that latter ones, as well as anthropomorphic and zoomorphic terracotta figurines, were not only stored in the building for further use, but perhaps served for the performance of cultic practices, especially in the upper floors. Similar to representative buildings in South Arabia, you can see here a wall painting from the South Arabian side of Qaryat al-Faw in nowadays Saudi Arabia. The private living quarters of the Ethio-Sabaean rulers and their families are assumed to be in the upper floors, while the more public ground floor served for carrying out various administrative procedures and also for storing goods or objects. Incense or gold could have been stored in the magazines. They were also used, for example, to store the bronze bowl from the Levantine culture, which was considered as prestige item and, as a Sabaean inscription indicates, was dedicated to the god Al-Makka in Yeha by a Sabaean stonemason from the site of Saba near Marib. You see on the left top the rest of the inscription and the decoration with his flying eagles in the frieze. In order to determine the administration and logistics for the construction effort, as well as to estimate the number of workers required for it, he made mass calculations of the building materials for the palace. These allow to determine the complexity of society necessary for the construction of such monumental buildings. Both the techniques used and the dimension of these structures require the engagement of a large number of workers trained in South Arabian techniques, including architects and stonemasons. The calculations so far showed that the lower floor of this palace alone required tree trunks almost 12 kilometers long, equivalent to an average of 1,000 trees. This does not even take into account the timber required for the ceilings, floors, and facades. Obviously, at the time of the palace construction, there was still a sufficiently large stock of old trees in the region, but most of them fell victim to the construction. Successive a deforestation of the region may be associated with these prestigious building programs in combination with the creation of large fields. In summary, according to the current state of research, it can be stated that at least some of these Ethio-Sabaean sites were already settled by the indigenous population in the 2nd millennium BC. So far, however, this has been demonstrated less by architectural features than by pottery, which date to the late 2nd millennium BC by means of C14 data. In a deep trench at Yeha, nearly 10 meters below the surface, we found anthropogenic layer directly above the natural rock, which date to the late 2nd millennium BC. The pottery found here is comparable in its incised decoration to pottery from the Sudanese lowlands, but locally produced, and attests to the close contacts of this region with the Gas Delta. But even in the Ethio-Sabaean period of the 1st millennium BC, there is still evidence of pottery from that region. Contacts with the Nile region can be traced, for example, in the continuity of the production technique for the so-called blacktop pottery, which I already showed at the beginning of the lecture. The aim of the South Arabian settlement policy was obviously to secure control in this region over already existing trade routes and export goods, such as gold and frankincense. Unlike in South Arabia, where frankincense grows, as mentioned, far away from Saba in today's Omani province of Sufar, there were frankincense trees on site here, and the harvest and trade could thus be directly controlled and organized. I have therefore drawn a different picture on the second map of the incense route, shown here. According to our new findings from the early 1st millennium BC onwards, this route can not only be traced across the Arabian Peninsula, but can also be extended, so to speak, to the areas around the northern Horn of Africa, and, as you know, since only very short period, also in the direction of nowadays Somaliland and Puntland. Aromatics such as frankincense has long been a desired product in this region. The demand for aromatics is much older than the actual frankincense root. Incense and other trade goods such as gold, ivory, exotic animals, etc., were important trade goods between Egypt and the land of Punt already from the middle of the 3rd millennium BC until the late 2nd millennium BC. The Ethio-Sabaean community existed from the beginning of the early 1st millennium BC only about 300 years. Thus, beyond the middle of the 1st millennium BC, no epigraphic sources or archaeological evidence can be found that can be clearly attributed to this culture horizon. The reasons for the decline are not yet clear, but it seems to be connected with the violent destruction of the Ethio-Sabaean monumental buildings by fire, even if it is not yet possible to say who triggered this event or when the fire exactly dates. The archaeological evidence indicates that all Ethio-Sabaean sites were abandoned around the middle of the 1st millennium BC. According to the current state of research, they were resettled again at the end of the 1st millennium BC with the rise of Aksum. The centuries between the Ethio-Sabaean and the early Aksumite cultures, a period of at least 300 years, remain still largely in the dark, also because of the lack of written sources. Compared to the Ethio-Sabaean society, the empire of Aksum, which formed around the turn of Christ's birth, it is a culture area with modified writing and a different language, new forms of design and different social characteristics. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much indeed for that amazing presentation, Dr. Gerlach. As is normal at this point in the lecture, we swap over to my colleague, Khaled Douglas, excuse me, who is going to give us a short 5 to 10 minute summary of your lecture in Arabic. So Khaled, if you're ready to go with that, you may like to unmute yourself and please take it away.
Yeah. Okay, thank you very much. Thank you, Aris, for this beautiful presentation. I enjoyed it a lot. So I was confusing actually between writing the notes and listening to the presentation. But anyway, I made some notes here. Okay, I will speak now in Arabic. موضوع المحاضرة هو يتحدث عن سبأ وإثيوبيا قبل 3000 سنة، دراسة للمعهد الألماني للآثار للعلاقات الثقافية بين جنوب الجزيرة العربية وشمال القرن الإفريقي. قامت المتحدثة بعمل مقدمة سريعة حول منطقة القرن الإفريقي والعلاقات التجارية والثقافية اللي كانت قائمة في المنطقة، خصوصا في منطقة المحيط الهندي مع جنوبي الجزيرة العربية، وكذلك باتجاه الشمال باتجاه مصر. تحدثت كذلك على أنه منطقة الدراسة في القرن الإفريقي تعرضت في الفترة الأخيرة إلى أعمال تخريب بسبب أعمال العنف اللي حصلت في المنطقة أخيرا. هنا تحدثت أيضا الباحثة عن الأدلة الواضحة اللي أشارت إلى العلاقات التجارية أو العلاقات الثقافية اللي كانت تربط القرن الإفريقي إثيوبيا خصيصا مع منطقة جنوبي الجزيرة العربية، امتدادا من منطقة سمهرم خروري في عمان إلى مناطق في اليمن وإلى شمال الجزيرة ووسط الجزيرة العربية. وهذا استمر خلال الألف الأول قبل الميلاد. وأشارت إلى هناك أدلة كثيرة حول هذا التبادل التجاري، وأشارت أيضا إلى أنه التواصل مع منطقة القرن الإفريقي يعود إلى مرحلة قبل ذلك، أيضا يعود إلى الألف الثالث قبل الميلاد مع مصر في تجارة الأوبسيديان، حيث عثر على أدلة تشير إلى ذلك، واستيراد مصر للأوبسيديان من منطقة مرتفعات إثيوبيا. بخصوص دراسة تركيز المعهد الألماني للآثار في برلين وجامعة يينا، قاموا بدراسة أو تركيز عمل دراسي حول العلاقات الثقافية بين اليمن وإثيوبيا بدءا من عام 2009، وما زال هذا البحث قائم حتى هذا الوقت. بخصوص العلاقة بين مأرب وسبا، تحدثت الباحثة عن إنه مملكة سبا أو تم تشكيل عدد من الواحات الصناعية في المنطقة المرتفعة من اليمن، منها واحة مأرب اللي أقيمت فيها مملكة سبا، كانت عاصمتها مأرب. شرحت الباحثة بشكل تفصيلي حول نظام الحصاد المائي اللي كان موجود في منطقة مملكة سبا، وكيفية تجميع مياه الأمطار واستعمالها لسقي الواحات المحيطة في المنطقة. فتحدثت عن إنشاء السدود، وتحدثت بشكل أكثر تفصيلا حول السد العظيم في وادي ضانا، وتحدثت عن طريقة تطوير تقنية متطورة من القنوات اللي ارتبطت بهذا السد العظيم واللي استخدمت لري الأراضي الزراعية المحيطة. وتحدثت أيضا حول الفترة الزمنية التي استخدم فيها هذا السد العظيم لقدرة بحوالي 1200 سنة، وبقيت حتى القرن السادس والسابع ميلادي. كذلك طورت المملكة السبا نظام تجاري لتجارة البخور في القرن الثامن، القرن السابع قبل الميلاد، امتد من جنوب الجزيرة العربية إلى شمالها، وهذا يؤشر على العلاقات التجارية وتطوير شبكة تجارية وطرق مطورة ومعقدة كانت تربط حواضر المنطقة مع بعضها البعض خلال القرن السابع والثامن قبل الميلاد. تحدثت على نقطة مهمة كثير، وهي كانت جزء مهم في محور هذا المحاضرة، وهي على موضوع الهجرات السبائية من منطقة اليمن إلى القرن الإفريقي، وخاصة إلى إثيوبيا اللي حصلت خلال القرن الثامن والسابع قبل الميلاد. وعرضت خارطة وضحت فيها نتيجة الدراسات للغة الأثرية بين المنطقتين، أشارت إلى أنه منطقة الهجرة ربما كانت في منطقة اليمن، في المنطقة الغربية منها، في منطقة الحامد والميدامان اللي انتقلوا إلى ميناء أدوليس في إثيوبيا وياها في إثيوبيا. ومن هنا بدأت بالحديث حول الأدلة الأثرية والمستوطنات اللي أقامها المهاجرين الجدد من اليمن في منطقة مرتفعات إثيوبيا، فحيث أقاموا عدد كبير من المستوطنات الدائمة هناك. ونتيجة الدراسة اللي قامت فيها الباحثة تشير إلى هناك وجود عدد كبير من المستوطنات الدائمة اللي أقيمت في المنطقة، قدر على الأقل عرضت على الأقل 16 مستوطنة وجدت في منطقة القرن الإفريقي، وتعود معظمها في أصولها إلى الثقافة السبائية في جنوب الجزيرة العربية. تحدثت بشكل أكثر تفصيلا حول موقعيها اللي يعتبر أحد أهم المواقع السبائية والمميزة. فقد يعتبر هذا الموقع هو موقع مستوطنة دائمي، ثم عثر فيها على عدد من المباني المميزة جدا، وأيضا كانت تحاط بجدار دفاعي ومنطقة تجارية ومنطقة ورش للعمل. كذلك عثروا على الحقول الزراعية اللي كانت موجودة في المنطقة، واللي كانت تضم أيضا شجر اللبان. ووجدت هناك في تشابه كبير في نظام إصلاح الأرض للزراعة بين ما عثر عليه في منطقة سبا وياها بشكل كبير، وهذا إن يدل على التواصل الثقافي الكبير اللي كان موجود بين المنطقتين. من عناصر التشابه أيضا اللي أكدت عليها الباحثة هو وجود المعبد في ياها، حيث عثر على معبد كبير يشبه بشكل كبير معبد المقة في صرواح، حيث يعني خصص هذا المعبد إلى المعبود أو الآلهة المقة. فوجدت هناك في تشابه كثير بين في المخطط المعماري والزخارف المعمارية اللي كانت تزين هذا المعبد مثل الوعول، حيث وجدت فيها بنفس الشكل اللي وجدت فيها في معبد صرواح. كذلك عثر في هذا المعبد فيها على عدد كبير من المباخر والأواني الفخارية اللي تشبه تلك الموجودة في سبا أو في مواقع مختلفة من سبا. كذلك عثر على مباخر حجرية كبيرة كانت مزخرفة بزخرفة الهلال والقرص، واللي تشبه بشكل كبير جدا ما عثر عليه أيضا في مواقع مملكة سبا. يعتقد أنه البنائين اللي قاموا في بناء الصروح المعمارية فيها كانوا يأتوا من سبأ، حيث عثر على أدلة كتابية تشير إلى ذلك. وعرضت إناء من البرونز يضم كتابات جنوبية عربية جنوبية تشير إلى أسماء هذول بعض البنائين اللي كان يتم استخدامهم في بناء هذه الصروح المعمارية. معبد يها هو مخصص لمعبود المقة، بني في منتصف القرن السابع قبل الميلاد، وعثر على نص كتابي على أحد جدران هذا المعبد تتحدث فيه بشكل واضح عن تخصيص هذا المعبد للمعبود المقة. تحدثت عن نظام البناء المعماري لمعبد المقة وبناؤه من الحجارة الضخمة والأعمدة التي كانت تزين هذا المعبد في الواجهة الأمامية منه، وتحدثت عن طريقة وكيفية استخراج هذه الأعمدة الحجرية أو القطع الحجرية، الكتل الحجرية الضخمة اللي هي كانت يتم إحضارها من مناطق بعيدة عن المعبد، قدرت حوالي 90 كيلومتر بعيدة عن المعبد، لكن هي الحجارة بالأساس هي محلية الأصل. وتعرض المعبد أيضا من جزء من الحديث عن المعبد أنه تعرض إلى التدمير في القرن الأول قبل الميلاد، وقد قام المعهد الألماني في أعمال الترميم لهذا المعبد بشكل كبير كثير، وعرضت لنا بعض صور ومخططات لأعمال الترميم اللي وجدت داخل هذا المعبد. أيضا تطرقت إلى أحد المرافق المعمارية الأخرى التي عثر عليها داخل ييحة، وهو مبنى ضخم جدا يعود في أصوله إلى القرن الثامن قبل الميلاد، وفسرت وظيفته على أنه قصر، وهو يعتبر المبنى الأقدم الذي استخدم فيه بناء الخشب في بنائه الخشب والحجارة. قدرت مساحته المخطط الأرضي للمبنى 60 في 60 متر مربع، ويضم على الأقل 4 طوابق وبنية من الحجارة والخشب، وهو يعتبر المبنى الأكبر على الإطلاق في شرق أفريقيا وجنوب الجزيرة العربية. عثر داخل هذا المبنى على عدد كبير من الأواني والمباخر اللي كان لها وظيفة دينية، واللي يعتقد أن بعض حجرات هذا المبنى كانت تستخدم لأغراض دينية، لكن الوظيفة العامة لهذا المبنى لم تكن لغرض ديني، وإنما أجزاء من هذا المبنى استخدمت لأغراض دينية، لكن يبدو أنه كان مبنى إداري وأكثر يشبه ما يكون إلى القصر. وبعد ذلك تطرقت الباحثة إلى عدد من الحفريات اللي أقيمت فيها، واللي أشارت إلى أن الموقع يعود إلى فترات أقدم من الألف الأول قبل الميلاد، حيث عثر على أدلة على أنه كان يعني مستوطنا في الألف الثاني أيضا قبل الميلاد، حيث عثر على أواني فخارية تشير على التواصل مع جنوبي السودان. تعتقد أنه انتهى الوجود السبعي مع نهاية الألف الأول قبل الميلاد مع ظهور مملكة أكسوم في المنطقة. That's all what I can summarize from your presentation, Aris. Thank you very
شكرا
much.
جزيلا خالد.